Okay, hello everybody. So I've done a number of dual streams too, actually, since the Kamala Harris pick was announced, and haven't devoted one of these very intimate, face-to-face, one-man streams to the subject yet. So I figured I would do that now, and that will also enable me to look at your super chats more easily should you have any desire to offer up any super chats. So, a couple of thoughts. Number one, you see this choice by Joe Biden of Kamala Harris as being framed like it's some kind of solemn historic gift to black and brown women everywhere, that they now have this representation on a national ticket. And not surprisingly, the people who tend to make that argument in favor of the wisdom of this choice are elites. They're elites in the sense that they are in prestigious media jobs, they are operatives, they have some professional investment in U.S. politics. Though I'm sure there are random people you could find on the street somewhere who view the Kamala Harris pick in those terms, meaning they're very much touched by the identity representation that it affords them on some abstract level. But clearly, this logic that the selection is this mind-blowingly historic triumph and that it fulfills all the deepest desires of underrepresented, marginalized communities throughout the United States is an elite argumentative project. And in fact, it explains why Kamala Harris had so much elite support early on in the 2020 Democratic primary cycle. Remember, she was touted when she announced her campaign in January of 2019 as the front runner. She was touted by people in this very same class, the media operative donor world. And she was touted as such because, according to them, she satisfied their vision of what the Democratic Party in the era of Trump should look like, meaning she was the ideal identity-based representation of what their priorities were in the present political context. And what happened over the course of the 2020 Democratic primary? Well, number one, Kamala Harris flamed out in humiliating fashion. If you took at face value how she was being heralded early on, she should have waltzed her way into the nomination. She was trumpeted as the front runner. She had a lot of donor support. She had a lot of definitely enthusiastic media support. All the operatives were singing her praises. And what turned out to happen is that her high point was the first debate in June of 2019, where she infamously ambushed Joe Biden and more or less called him a racist. She did the whole, I'm not calling you a racist, Joe, but ... routine, which anybody with a brain knew was intended to convey that Joe Biden had what you could most charitably call outdated racial attitudes and put him out of touch with the current inclinations of the Democratic primary electorate. That was the message that Kamala tried to convey with that ambush, and then she capitalized on it. It was a pre-planned marketing stunt. They had T-shirts ready to sell right away with her catchphrase, "That little girl was me." They had it all ready to go almost instantaneously. So it was a ploy, and she later admitted it was a ploy. As this VP selection process was underway, and it could have just all been for show, maybe she was always the pick. That's actually reasonably likely. She was occasionally asked in interviews about this exchange she had with Biden at that first debate, and she did her deflecting, creepy laugh where she goes, "Ha ha 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 ha! It was a debate." So she's not willing to defend on the merits the accusation that she leveled because she clearly didn't believe in the merits of the accusation that she leveled. It clearly had no bearing on any kind of substantive policy dispute that she was trying to bring to the fore with Biden. It was simply a self-aggrandizing stunt. And she's more or less admitted it. So she admitted that she essentially concocted a fake attack on the nominee of the party, insinuating heavily that he was a racist. And she's rewarded for that by being put on the ticket with the guy that she smeared as a racist. I mean, if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the elite attitudes that are existent within the current iteration of the Democratic Party, that I don't know what would. But after that attack, she got a little bit of a sugar high after that first debate, and then she plunged. She had no coherent, really, message. Her staff rebelled. There was long New York Times articles written about how floundering her campaign was, and there were people on her staff saying that they had never experienced anything so disastrous. And then she ends up dropping out before any voting had taken place. So, in terms of a candidate who had such enormous hype, that outcome was a humiliation. And all of a sudden, she's just presumed to be this leading contender for VP on the basis of what? Well, she is the favored representational candidate of the elite factions within the Democratic Party intelligentsia, whereas Biden was not their chosen representation. Biden had very little elite support, at least relative to what you would expect for a vice presidential nominee. I'm talking about early on in the process. There was an elite coalescence around Biden eventually. But through the vast majority of the primary cycle, Biden was not the natural choice of the power brokers, more of the intelligentsia portion of the party coalition. He was sort of forced upon them, whereas they would have much preferred somebody like Harris or even Warren. But now they're placated. They're placated because Kamala's on the ticket. You saw the New York Times almost head over heels in their coverage of this pick. They're now truly excited about the Democratic ticket. Were they always excited about removing Trump from office? Sure, but now they're excited about the ticket on its own terms as well because of the history-making potential that Kamala represents. And this brought to mind for me an infographic that you can go and search out from January of 2019. This was even before Biden had announced his campaign, but the New York Times did this sort of brief summary of the candidates who had at that point declared for president, two of which were Kamala Harris and Tulsi. And it's so illuminating to go back even now and look at how the two candidates were described. Kamala Harris, it was front and center in the New York Times telling that she embodied this incredible history-making potential because of her identity status. Whereas for Tulsi, go back and look at it. There was no history-making potential mentioned, even though she's a woman, she's a person of color, if you want to call it that. She has an ethnic background that generally is not represented in elite power structures, being partially, Samoan. So you would think if the history making potential of Kamala was touted with such vigor, then it would also be applied to Tulsi, given that she has the same characteristics in that sense. But it was nowhere to be found in her infographic. Instead, what they chose to focus on was the fact that she met with Assad, of course, which was declared extremely controversial and damning, and her, history of LGBT comments, which she had already at that point robustly explained and made amends for and spoken about her evolution on the topic. But it just shows you how narratives are crafted from the outset by the elite actors who exert influence on electoral cycles. So Kamala was elevated right away, whereas other candidates were diminished. And this sort of came to a head when, at the second round of debates, Kamala and Tulsi had their also famous or infamous exchange. And that was attributed in a subsequent New York Times article as a major cause of Kamala's downfall, because she was totally incapable of responding to the charges that Tulsi leveled on the merits. And those charges had to do with healthcare, which is the lesser known one, and then also criminal justice. Kamala was almost incredible to watch. I can recall I was actually there in person in Detroit, and Kamala just had no ability to defend her own record, because she was in sort of a bind at the time. Like, she didn't want to fully embrace her top cop. She previously described herself as the top cop of California because she had been attorney general, but she was also trying to triangulate her way out of that image by saying, "Oh, I'm this very progressive prosecutor, and I'll take on Trump, whatever, with my prosecutorial zeal." But she didn't want to be associated with the more punitive aspects of her tenure. And so she was boxed into this weird place where she couldn't even coherently defend her own record as the chief law enforcement official in the largest state in the union. And that was made abundantly clear by her extremely faltering performance in the exchange with Tulsi, which the donors noticed, Kamala's donors noticed, and that set the groundwork for the ultimate collapse of her campaign. But yeah, that exchange with Tulsi now is probably going to be, it already has been, but you can be pretty sure that it's going to be circulated over and over and over again. But, I wouldn't expect Tulsi herself to be making those same points with the same kind of fervency or with the same kind of sense of purpose that she did last year, because she's focused on other things now. There's no primary campaign underway. You got COVID spiking in Hawaii, and she has other things that she's focusing on. But still, that's going to be cited definitely on repeat. And it's also interesting to contrast that exchange that Tulsi initiated with Kamala and that second debate with the Biden exchange that Kamala initiated in the first debate, because the Tulsi exchange, both on the issues of healthcare and criminal justice, were 100% substantive and predicated on Tulsi's sincere policy beliefs. So she was saying that Kamala had essentially outsourced her healthcare plan to a lobbyist, Kathleen Sebelius, who had been the Secretary of Health and Human Services of the Obama administration. And that contradicted Tulsi's policy beliefs in the area of healthcare in terms of seeking to limit the ability of industry actors to dictate how plans are crafted. And then on top of that, the criminal justice area, where Tulsi was criticizing Kamala, for example, laughing about marijuana legalization when she was Attorney General of California and locking up people for trivial drug offenses, where she now wants to be presented as this progressive prosecutor. So those are all informed by Tulsi's actual sincere beliefs, and it wasn't just a stunt. Is there always a political calculation involved when you're talking about a presidential debate and a national forum where views are being expressed and people are developing opinions about different candidates? Sure, that's a component. But it wasn't just a pure PR stunt like Kamala's attack on Biden, which was a stunt. Kamala pretty soon thereafter admitted that there was zero policy implications in terms of her attack on Biden. It was simply about going through this routine of presenting herself, Kamala, as this sort of enlightened alternative to Biden on a pure personality basis, whereas Tulsi was substantive. So I think that's sort of an illuminating contrast, and it's also illuminating as to who gets rewarded through political accolades and ascensions to heightened power. Is it people who focus on the substance or people who focus on theatrics? Clearly, it's the latter, given Kamala's elevation to the vice presidential ticket. So, yeah, that's sort of my initial thoughts on Kamala. I'm going to be writing about, and I mentioned this in the stream yesterday with Nancy Rommelman, if you happen to watch that. But I am going to write a little bit more about this tension between the top cop image and the protest of Kamala and the protest movement. I mean, a lot of the tensions should be self-evident, but it's even more so in the case of Kamala, because not just like 2 weeks or so ago, she was at a Senate hearing where she was defending the Portland protesters. It's nothing more but, peaceful and, these down home moms and vets and things who are just out there calling for their rights and are being, jeoparded by the Trump administration. Whereas if you actually go to the protest, which I doubt she's really, I'm almost certain she hasn't been there, or that she's getting particularly good information, or if she is getting the accurate information, then she's just ignoring it. Because if you go to those protests, they're chanting ACAB, all cops are bastards, which means that no cops are moral within the a lot of criminal justice system as it currently exists, because the system is inherently racist, white supremacist, and fascist. So anybody who wants to, quote, reform the system by trying to be an individually virtuous cop is barking up the wrong tree in their minds, because it's impossible. And clearly that would also apply to Kamala. So for her to have this staunch defense of the protests when she herself will be implicated directly by their condemnatory rhetoric is a tension that's at least worth exploring. And so we'll see how that comes up. I think you'll also see somewhat bad faith attacks by Republicans who will do things like cite the Tulsi exchange and cite aspects of Kamala's criminal justice record, which they are themselves in favor of in terms of the punitive approach. Like, they're not offended by Kamala aggressively prosecuting drug offenders on the substance. They just think that it's a potential wedge issue that they can exploit. Now, are there some more libertarian inclined Republicans who maybe do have a substantive criticism? Yeah, sure. But like, for the most part, it's just a political tactic that they're using to try to exploit potential tensions within the Democratic coalition, which definitely do exist. But it's not as though they're operating from a completely good faith standpoint. So that's also something to be wary of. And then in terms of how I titled this video, like, is Kamala going to be calling the shots? I mean, I do think that she will be a much. I mean, I do think that this vice presidential pick is a lot more consequential than vice presidential picks typically are. Although throughout history, they've gotten more consequential as the years have gone on. Since usually, the most the pivot point in terms of the significance of vice presidents is generally, I think, regarded to be Mondale. Under Carter, in terms of the elevated kind of stature that he was afforded. Um, but vice presidents have generally gotten more and more impactful, to use a kind of annoying word, in the modern era, just because the executive branch wields so much power that some of it has to be delegated out. And so the vice presidency is not just the ceremonial role that it once was. I mean, you actually have a real portfolio. I mean, but Mike Pence is the one overseeing the coronavirus task force, for example, right now. And Biden was charged with a number of consequential policy tasks, like withdrawing from Iraq, for example. So yeah, it is significant, and just given Biden's advanced age, and given the fact that clearly the elite power centers of the party are more personally enthusiastic about Kamala than they are Biden, then she's going to be kind of more in touch with them and represent their interests with some degree of stridency, I would say, in the administration, should it come about. On a political level, though, I do think that this is a poor choice. I've said all along, if I was just a strategist trying to get Joe Biden elected, I would have strongly advised against this pick. Not that he won't still win, he still may. But I think it's very likely that this choice repels more voters than it attracts. Because there's a lot of condescension in terms of just assuming that Kamala is the pick who's naturally going to motivate voters, particularly black voters, who wouldn't have otherwise voted for Biden and now will because Kamala's on the ticket. I just don't think there's any real reason to believe that. Look at her performance in the primaries. And look at the fact that she's just not, I'm sorry, I know people are going to condemn me for even mentioning this, but it's true. She's not an ADOS. She's not an American descendant of slaves. So she just has a different ethnic background than the vast majority of black Americans. And now that doesn't mean that she can't insinuate herself politically into a role that makes her in tune with their political attitudes. Obama did that to a large extent, but Obama, he was, his political coming of age was in the South Side of Chicago. He married an ADOS woman, Michelle, but Kamala just sort of a different background, especially as a prosecutor, married to a corporate lawyer who's like a white Jewish guy. It's just sort of different. Being from Berkeley is just a different experience than being from the South Side of Chicago. So are there some people who might now be more inclined to vote for Biden who wouldn't have otherwise? There might be a couple, but I think there are other picks that Biden could have made that would have been a lot more sound, even if you're going with the women imposition that he brought upon himself in terms of only being allowed to pick a woman for some reason, imposing a gender test, which is a first. I would have gone with a Val Demings or a Karen, even potentially a Karen Bass, although she probably might have had some issues. Or who are the others? I don't know. I mean, voters aren't voting on the basis of identity in the first place. So why not just pick somebody who's going to help you govern? It's foolish. And Kamala gets a lot of media hype, but it hasn't correlated with any real electoral support. So I think she's going to dissuade people from certain people from voting for Biden. I mean, I think Val Demings is who I would have picked if I were just his strategist. Who, and I mentioned this on one of my previous streams, but she was the police chief of Orlando, and yet she's an ADOS. She's pretty sharp in terms of her performance and oversight hearings. She was an impeachment manager. Not that I'm supporting the impeachment boondoggle, but I'm just saying she showed that she has some political aptitude. Kamala, I mean, says who? I mean, what is her upside other than flattering the elites of the party? So, anyway, again, that doesn't preclude Biden from winning the presidency. I think it's still relatively likely, but I think this probably harms him more than it helps him. And yet, given the incentives operative within the party coalition now, maybe it was just necessary. Otherwise, there would have been a rebellion. Although, what's the alternative? Vote for Trump? Of course not. So, I think he could have been better served by better advice here, assuming his lucidity, which is also up for debate somewhat. All right, everybody. So that's it for now. Let me go and check this chats to see if I missed any. Just give me one moment. I bookmarked how to find my super chats easily because sometimes it eludes me. But here we go. Oh, no super chats from this chat. I'm terribly offended. How dare you? That's okay. Life goes on. All right. Talk to you soon. Stay safe. Stay cool. Stay cool. Almost literally, because it's quite hot out and humid and depressingly uncomfortable in the Northeast. So I got my AC blasting. Make sure it's blasting wherever you are. Blast it right in your stupid face. All right. So long.